Welcome to the podcast called The Battle for African Agriculture, where we use the lens of political economy to look at the future of African agriculture. I'm your host. My name is Belay. I'm the General Coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. Please, if you have not done so, or if you have not done yet, please subscribe and share and click on the button that's in front of you, and you will help us to reach as many viewers as possible. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Peter Rosset, one of the most influential thinkers and practitioners in the global movement for agroecology and food sovereignty. Peter Rosset is an agroecologist, author, and longtime activist who has spent decades studying and supporting peasant movements around the world. He's currently affiliated with Ecosur in Mexico and has worked with La Via Campesina, the world's largest peasant movement. Many listeners may know him through his influential books and writings, including Agroecology, Science and Politics, The Greening of Revolution. Peter has also written extensively about the transformation of agriculture in Cuba, particularly how the country shifted towards agroecology after the collapse of the Soviet Union. His work on Cuba is often cited as one of the most important real-world examples of how agroecology can scale through farmer-to-farmer networks and strong social movements. I'm very much happy to talk about this issue in particular. Peter, welcome to the Battle for African Agriculture. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Million. It's great to be together again after so many years since we last
Yeah,
saw each other, and so I'm really happy to be here. Thank
close
you
to
for the
20 years,
invitation.
huh?
Yeah,
Close
I
to
think
20. Oh
so.
my God, yeah. Peter, I know you to some extent, but for those viewers who do not know you, how did you personally come into the world of agroecology and food sovereignty? Who are you?
I would say that as I grew up, originally was born in the United States, but then moved to Mexico and later on became a Mexican citizen, which I am now.
Mm,
But originally, I guess we could say that I was a city kid, and
like
uh,
me.
right. And my sister is actually a farmer, but I'm a city kid, and I was very politically active at the time. It was the movement against the United States war against the people of Vietnam, and
Mm,
around a number of other issues. And
mm,
so, on the one hand, I was involved in political activism, and on the other hand, I was very interested and concerned about environmental issues and also studying in the university uh, biology originally, which
mm,
eventually led me to agroecology through various different kinds of twists and turns of one's training. And when I finally discovered agroecology, I saw the way to merge sort of the different sides of myself, my political
mm,
commitment and activism, together with my concern about the environment, together with some of my more academic or science related interests. But the important thing is, I guess I started being interested on the more technical agronomic side of agroecology. But by then, I then began, let's say, I began the rest of my life looking at it
mm,
backwards in retrospect of living in Latin America and lived in the country of Nicaragua, which our viewers may or may not
mm,
know or remember in 1979 had a more or less socialist armed revolution. And I ended up being what people called an internationalist, meaning foreign people who went to work with the new revolutionary government. Why did people
mm,
go internationally to work with the revolutionary government in Nicaragua at that time? It was because most of the government technical staff fled because they were what we would call counter-revolutionary and
mm,
had been happy with the previous dictator and not happy with a people's revolution. And so the
mm,
government was simply stripped of everybody with technical expertise. they started a massive training for new people, but in the meantime, they accepted or even sought off international expertise to temporarily hold things down while a new generation was trained. And so I ended up spending quite a few years in Nicaragua at that time, and
Mm-hmm.
my interest on the more technical side of agroecology changed through abundant contact with reality, with small farmers, with peasants, to
In
concern
Nicaragua.
in Nicaragua, to concern with the more social aspects of agroecology. Because what I
Mm,
realized is that most of our research on alternatives to chemical agriculture, to monoculture, focuses on the very technical specificities of those alternatives. Will it be compost? Will it be companion planting or intercropping or
mm,
agroforestry? Will it be biological pesticides? What will it be
mm,
on the technical
mm,
side? But I
mm,
came to realize that actually these kind of alternatives exist already abundantly in most territories. The
mm,
problem is that maybe a lot of people or most people aren't actually using them in their farming. And so
mhm,
then I came to the realization that on the social side lay the big questions about agroecology.
mm,
And years over many years, but Nicaragua is when I first started to realize it, that the building of a social process was important. Otherwise, all of those wonderful alternatives would just be floating out there and nobody
mm,
would use
mm,
them. And
mm,
so from that point, I gradually started to focus more on the social side. And I also started to realize that many of the problems that peasants face in today's world, beyond the technical problem, which is not the number one problem for most small farmers by far, are all of the problems of social exclusion, of economic exclusion, of land grabbing, all of those kind of things.
mm,
The
mm,
only way that rural communities can survive in the difficult environment that is the contemporary world is by being organized. And so I
mm,
started to realize that if in agroecology the social side is the most important, in preserving peasant livelihoods in general, the
mm,
peasants being organized and able to defend themselves collectively is also very important. So I gradually moved from this kind of a technical outlook to a kind of a social and political organizing point of view, which, as you said in the introduction, eventually led to me working for many, many, many years later in my life with La Via Campesina, the global movement of
mm,
small farmer, peasant, and indigenous peoples organizations, um,
mm,
which coined the term food sovereignty, and which has been very important in terms of precisely working with member organizations to build these social processes in order for agroecology to be spread and adopted amongst the peasants who belong to the organizations that are part of La Via Campesina. So I can
What are
say
the
that the
social
changes began
processes?
then.
What are
The
the
social,
social process? Yes, social.
yeah,
Why social? What are the social things that you're talking about? Yeah.
I think the easiest way to think about it is to imagine oneself and one's family
Mm,
as small scale farmers or food producers, and for whatever reason, one and one's family have decided that we're not going to use any poisonous chemicals anymore in agriculture or expensive chemicals. We are going to become like an agroecological paradise of
mm,
agroecological farming, producing organic food. But if we don't belong to any kind of uh, social fabric, organized social fabric, in which other people have the opportunity to learn about us, to visit our farm, to be inspired by our farm, to learn how we do things, then we won't have a multiplier effect. We can remain like
mm,
an island of agroecology in a sea of chemical monoculture. The only
mm,
way I found over the years in any significant numbers for other people to learn about this experience, to want to do something similar in their own farmland, is to have an organized process that identifies who are the families who have
mm,
something interesting to share in terms of
mm,
agroecological farming, and who are the other families who could be inspired, who could learn important things from visiting that production,
Mm.
that farm, and taking it back to their own farm. So that's the social process. And really what we
Okay.
found over the years is it has to be people's organization, people's own organization, a peasant movement, a community organization that that makes a decision to construct this kind of a social process and to arrange these
Okay.
kind of farmer to farmer exchanges.
Oh, that's fascinating. You often say that agroecology is a science and a practice and social movement. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm not the first person to say it, but I've repeated it a
Yeah, I
lot. Let's
know.
put it
You
that way.
repeatedly saying it,
You're right.
yes.
That's right. So I would say it's a science in the sense that although people who criticize the chemical monoculture model and who proposed alternatives were looked down upon, were ridiculed, were made fun of by institutions
Mm,
like faculties of agronomy, like the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO,
mm,
like government agriculture ministries for many, many, many years. Through a lot of hard work, eventually agroecology, especially by agroecologists like Miguel Altieri, eventually
mm,
was became accepted, let's say at the level of Western science or the modern university academy as a science
mm,
in the Western sense of science
mm,
and in the Western philosophical sense. So it's
mm,
the so we can think of it as the science that studies how agricultural ecosystems or agroecosystems work in terms of the soil component, the biological component, the human component, the ecological
mm,
interactions, the social interactions, the economics, everything about that system. How does it work? And how does that
mm,
knowledge help us to design alternative systems that perhaps don't use poisonous chemicals or are different or alternative in other ways? So that's the sense that we can say it's a science. But and I also think it's very important to say that although it may be some academics in universities who fought inside the university so that it would be accepted as a science, but the actual knowledge comes from the second category, which is the farming practices
yeah.
of small farmers. And these farming practices, the more agroecological ones, generally speaking, are based on thousands of years of accumulated
Mm,
knowledge,
mm,
accumulated innovations by small farmers and indigenous people, passed down by parents to sons and daughters to grandchildren over generations.
mm,
And I would say that almost all of the so-called innovation in agriculture over the 10,000 years or so of agriculture has been done by these small farmers. They were the ones who
mm,
domesticated all of today's food crops and livestock species from wild relatives and developed the different ways that they could be cultivated or those animals could be raised. Without that accumulated knowledge and experimentation by small farmers over those 10,000 years, we wouldn't even have agriculture today
mm, mm,
as a human species. So we're talking about their practices and traditional agriculture, the kind of agriculture that everybody practiced, we could say, before chemical pesticides and commercial seeds and chemical fertilizers and tractors and mechanical harvesters were even invented and allowed humanity to eat and live for thousands of years. Those practices constitute the more practical side of agroecology. So if we think of on the one hand a science, but on the other hand, it's those accumulated practices. It's how people practice farming that doesn't depend on monoculture and chemicals. And then the third
mm,
thing is a movement, and here's where the whole importance comes in of resistance of small farmers, peasants, indigenous people to all of the forces. And I guess I already mentioned this original in the beginning of this talk about how there's so many forces that threaten to displace people from their
yeah.
land, all kinds of land grabbing, and they
Mm,
have to be organized to defend themselves. And it turns out, in terms of the social process needed to for agroecology to multiply, they also have to be organized in order to uh, have a kind of a scaling in terms of the number of families who practice agroecology. And so that's the kind of the movement aspect. And
Yeah.
beyond that, I would say people would say, okay, it's a science, it's a movement, and a practice. But for the people who are on the practice side, it's also can be seen as a way of life,
Yeah.
of a particular way set of
Mm.
ways of being in the world, of acting in the world, of seeing the world, and it has spiritual dimensions, people's historic and symbolic and spiritual relationship to the land, to Mother Earth, and it has social dimensions, political dimensions, biological and technical dimensions. It's very
Mm.
multi-dimensional beyond even the science, practice, and movement.
Thank you so much. Fascinating. You've written extensively about Cuba's transition towards agroecology, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. First, just put Cuba into a context. Where do we get it? There's so many people who know Cuba because of probably Fidel Castro, or now a US embargo, or then, a most averted nuclear war between Russia and US, probably. But just put Cuba in the context, in the Latin America and the global context,
Yes.
and um, and what has happened uh, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and how people responded.
Yeah. So, and
Thank you so
maybe
much.
some of our younger listeners really don't even know those few things that
That's
you
exactly
mentioned.
it.
So we can't
Yeah,
take it for granted. So
yeah.
Cuba is an island nation in the
Mm,
Caribbean Sea, uh, actually close to the southern coast of the United States, at the end of the Gulf of Mexico. Um,
unfortunately, yeah.
Right, unfortunately for them, so close to the
So
imperial
close,
giant.
yeah.
But it's a country that was a Spanish colony, and
Mhm,
originally when the European invasion of the Americas took place more than 500 years ago, the indigenous people who originally lived on the island of Cuba were pretty much killed by European genocide, and the
yeah.
European colony wanted to use Cuba as a monocrop export platform,
Mm,
primarily of sugar cane, but also a few other crops that were needed in the home countries of the
mm.
European colonizers. And so
To
since they
sweeten their
had
coffee and tea. Mm,
Exactly. So since they
mm,
had oops, killed all the indigenous people, who was going to do all the work? Because the
mm,
Europeans themselves certainly weren't going to do all that work planting sugarcane. So first they began it began to be a key destination for the slave trade. Africans who were kidnapped in Africa and taken across the ocean and sold to landowners
mm,
who needed labor. And so there was a very large, or today there is a very large Afro-Cuban population. Cuba is an important
mm,
part of the African diaspora. Since we're talking
mm,
about Africa
mm,
today, that's very important. Maybe 50% of the population of Cuba could be called Afro-Cuban. And then
mm,
around in the 1800s, when slavery was banned in country after country in the Caribbean and Latin America, and eventually was banned in Cuba, it created a second labor shortage. And so
mm,
Cuban landowner at this point Cuban, but we're talking about those Cubans who were descendants of the European
mm,
colonizers, not those Cubans who were brought over as slaves and were therefore
mm,
poor, but the rich Cubans, still the landowners. They began to import Chinese workers
mhm,
who migrated from China to the Philippines in search
mhm,
of work, then found their way on sailing ships that went from the Philippines to the Pacific coast of Mexico, then came
mhm,
by land across Mexico to the Caribbean side of Mexico, and then got on new ships that went to Cuba, where they were virtually slaves because they were indentured workers because they had to work until they paid off the cost of all of those trips paid for by their
mm,
so-called employers. But
mm,
essentially, they were a new group of slave workers in Cuba sugar plantations, such that by 1900, if 50% of the population were what are called Afro-Cubans, 25% were Chinese Cubans. And so today,
mm,
Cuban culture, which is a very rich and vibrant culture, produces world famous salsa music, for example,
mm,
is a mix is a very rich cultural mixture. about half
Mm.
African cultural roots, and then two other quarters European and Chinese cultural roots, and a little bit of
25%
the
are
few,
Chinese. Oh, wow.
right, and a few of the indigenous people maybe who somehow survived. And all of that
Yeah.
mixed together has produced a very vibrant culture. But it was a culture that was marked by extreme poverty because under the Spanish colony, it was a few rich white landowners and then a lot of poor first African slaves and then Chinese
Mm.
workers who constitute what today would be called the Cuban peasantry. And
Mm.
most of the peasants, let's say by the early 1900s, were landless, or if they had
Mm.
land, they lived on the estate of the large landowner, and they were indentured labor. In exchange for their labor, they were allowed a very small plot of land to grow food for
Mm.
themselves and their
Mm.
family, which didn't get them out of extreme poverty one way or another. Then they started rising up against the Spanish colony, and at the moment when they were about to triumph, the United States intervened militarily early in the 1900s,
Mm.
supposedly on the side of the Cuban revolutionists, but in fact, it turned out was for Cuba to become a new colony, a colony essentially
Mm.
of the United States, more of an
Mm.
economic colony than a political colony. And so
Mm.
the feudal landlords of the Spanish colony, many of them were replaced by agribusiness and sugar companies from the United States, who
Mm.
contributed to the already long-standing practice of mistreating workers and keeping them in extreme poverty and keeping the
Mm.
majority of the peasantry landless, all of which, and so that combined with the frustrated attempt of Cubans to do a revolution themselves meant that it was a hotbed of revolutionary sentiment in the population. First against
Mm.
the Spanish, then after the United States stole their revolution against being a semi colony of the United States and against large U.S. agribusiness companies. And then all of this came to a head with the armed revolution that triumphed in 1959. And of course, the most famous leader that people remember was Fidel Castro, who later became the president for many, many, many years, and Che Guevara,
Mm.
his trusted right hand man, who
Mm.
for a while was a government minister and then
Yeah.
left to promote other revolutions around the world. So, but essentially, since 1959, Cuba has been a socialist slash communist country based on
Mm.
a popular revolution, a revolution that was majoritarily driven by peasants. It was, we could say it was a peasant uprising that was led by the people with the famous names like Fidel Castro that we remember
Mm.
today, and they immediately tried to become independent of colonial influence, both former
Mm.
European colonial influence and United States neo-colonial influence. And of course, as we know, the United States and other imperial countries don't like that. And so conflict with the United States was almost immediate
Mm.
uh, in around 1960, 61, shortly after the revolution, when John Kennedy was the president of the United States attempted an invasion of Cuba using Cuban exiles who are mostly
Mm.
soldiers of the deposed dictator who had fled to the United States, then trained by the CIA and then sent to invade Cuba. They were defeated by the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban people. And then
Mm.
the fury of the United States led the United States to create what the United States calls an economic embargo, and what Cubans call an economic blockade, and what today in today's world might be called sanctions against
Mm.
Cuba since the early 1960s until today. Continues even worse than ever today in 2026. So
Mm.
Cuba is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world because they dared to try to create an alternative to neocolonialism, I think would be the best
Mm.
way to put
Mm.
it.
Mm.
Now,
Mm.
there are a few key points around that history. One is that while the former Soviet Union and the former socialist countries in Eastern Europe existed and had what is called or was called the socialist bloc, let's say these countries may have had their imperfections and their reasons to deserve criticism, but they were very different from capitalist countries and from today's capitalist countries. So these European socialist countries constituted the trade partners for Cuba and the investment partners since Cuba was facing economic sanctions from the United States, and with the United States, the rest of the Western allied countries allied to U.S. imperialism. So as a result, Cuba was able to survive this economic blockade for quite a few decades because they had trade partners, and the trade
Yeah.
relationship with the former Soviet Union and socialist
Mm.
bloc was a better trade relation than most countries in the global south had or have within the capitalist bloc of countries. And the way that
Mm.
you measure, is it a better or worse trade relationship for a country that's dependent on agriculture, let's say that produces sugar, you could say, how many tons of sugar did Cuba have to export in order to earn enough to import one tractor? And then you can
Mm.
say, okay, so Cuba cost so many tons of sugar to get one tractor. How many tons of sugar did it cost a capitalist country in the Caribbean to get a tractor from the capitalist countries? Turns
Mm.
out that Cuba could get 7 times more tractors for the same amount of sugar,
Mm.
having trade with socialist countries than those countries who had trade with capitalist countries. So
Like Tobago,
they had a
Trinidad,
better
and other
trade
places.
relationship. And
Mm.
so some people call that a subsidy from the Soviet
Mm.
Union or the socialist countries. Other people
Mm.
might call it fair trade. But any way you want to look
Mm.
at it, the existence of the socialist bloc was very important to the Cuban economy. And so
Mm.
in 1989 and 1990, when the Wall fell and the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries in Europe disappeared, what happened to Cuba? Because Cuba had all of their trade with them, and now they were all brought into the capitalist bloc and started accepting the U.S. sanctions. What happened was Cuba lost 85% of its trade with the outside
Mhm.
world. And you know, in the this period in world history, it's very difficult to think of any country in the world producing absolutely everything that its population needs without doing some kind of trade with other
Yeah.
countries,
Yeah.
starting with the
Yeah.
fact that Cuba doesn't have a significant amount of petroleum and so needed
Mm.
petroleum. And so Cuba was plunged into an economic crisis around
Mm.
1990, and then
Mm.
Fidel Castro was still alive, and they declared what they called the special period in this, which was the special period was a wartime style economy, even though there was no war, meaning that you
Mm.
have austerity, you try to make do with whatever local resources you have, and
Mm.
so that was very, very severe. It plunged Cuba into a short-term food crisis at the beginning of the 1990s because under that trade relation with the socialist countries, Cuba was an agro-export country, like many countries in the
Mm.
global south, and a food importer. So two-thirds
Mm.
of the food was imported from the socialist countries, not
Wow.
produced in
Wow.
Cuba itself. And for
Two
the one
thirds. Okay.
Two-thirds, and for the
Oh my
one third
God.
they produce themselves, plus for all of the export crops, mainly sugar, coffee, and citrus that they were sending to the socialist countries, they had what's called the Green Revolution model. It was large scale
Okay. Mm.
monoculture and based on mechanization and based on chemical fertilizer, pesticides, commercial seeds,
Mm.
which they
Mm.
imported from the Soviet Union and the socialist countries. All of that technology available to them because of their trade relation. Another detail I forgot to mention was that in the Cuban Revolution, they did a revolutionary land reform, putting a significant proportion of the land in the hands of the former landed peasants. And one of the successes of the revolution was that living standards in rural Cuba rose very, very, very significantly and steadily over many, many decades. And so that Cuban
Mhm. Mm.
peasants were, from an economic point of view, from an access to education point of view, from an access to healthcare point of view, much better off than peasants in other countries in Latin America and the
Mm.
Caribbean. So this crisis happened where Cuba suddenly had to go from being a country who was dependent on imports in order to eat to a country who couldn't import anything and had to produce
Mm,
all of its own food. It had to go from one third to three-thirds food,
mm,
domestic food production, and it had to do so losing all of the technology it had become dependent on. It couldn't import any parts for the tractors that it already had. It couldn't
mm.
import any new tractors. It could hardly import any petroleum or gasoline. Couldn't import
Right.
any fertilizer. Couldn't import any commercial seeds. Couldn't import any pesticides. So had to radically change the technological basis of agriculture
Mm,
at the same time as it went from producing from a third of its food to two-thirds of its food. So that's
mm,
why that transition took a little bit of time and it went through a terrible food crisis. Eventually,
mm.
it came out of the food crisis. It came out of the food crisis thanks to the Cuban small farmers, the Cuban peasants who had benefited from the revolutionary agrarian reform, becoming agroecological farmers. And I could say
Mhm.
that where does our story for this podcast begin? It begins with Cuba as a nation overcoming the kind of a food crisis that maybe no other nation in the world could overcome.
Yeah,
Overcoming
exactly.
it
My
how?
God.
By small farmers, by what we call peasants, uh, going from chemical monoculture into agroecological production. So that's, I think,
Thank
and we can say
you.
at this point it's the biggest success story anywhere in the world for agroecological production because today more than one half of all of the farmers in the entire nation of Cuba practice agroecology, and Cuba still exists because they practice agroecology.
Unpack that for us now. How
Yes.
did that happen? How did they turn to agroecology? Where did the knowledge come from? What was the role of government there? Was there a knowledge base in the scientific world also, with the science and with the people? Just unpack that for us.
Yeah. So one
Yeah,
key thing obviously was that the necessity was there. So
yeah,
they had to
yeah,
figure out a way to produce food
yeah,
without any imported inputs or machines. So they had to do
yeah,
it, but where did they get the knowledge? And I would say
yeah.
that uh, at the beginning, let's say the first 10 years, 1990 to 2000 or less, 1990 to 1997, principally, it was the government Ministry of Agriculture and government agricultural extension service that relied on Cuban scientists to provide knowledge
Mm,
to be taught to farmers. And so this was important or this was possible to any extent at all because many Cuban scientists had actually realized years before the crisis that it wasn't healthy for a country to be completely dependent either on imported
mm,
food or on imported technology. And so many Cuban scientists had long before changed their own research into research on alternatives
oh,
and on what today might be called agroecology. And there was like a small movement among scientists to change their research. So that's
already.
right, already. So that knowledge in
Oh,
research
okay.
institutes and universities was there, but kind of an academic, formal science knowledge. And so
Mm,
the government tried to mobilize that towards farmers, but
mm,
honestly, it didn't work all that well. And
mm,
that's why the food crisis dragged on for quite a while
mm,
in the 1990s. And the key moment that changed all of it, and one point I should mention is that all of these Cuban peasants who got land through the revolutionary agrarian reform, they formed a national peasant organization called the
mhm,
National Association of Small Farmers because of the acronym in Spanish. It's ANAP, ANAP, which is a member of La Via Campesina, the global peasant movement. Uh, they almost all of the peasants in Cuba they are members of the ANAP. And in 1997, one of the cadre of ANAP had to travel to Honduras for some kind of a
mhm,
meeting. and he passed through Nicaragua. Nicaragua was the new socialist revolution where I was living, or
Mm,
had been living prior to that
mm,
point. And there was an interesting experience in Nicaragua called the campesino a campesino, or the peasant to peasant movement. He was
mhm.
unable to continue to travel to Honduras because Honduras was a U.S. ally and denied his visa. So he ended up getting stuck in Nicaragua for about 10 years, not 10 years,
Wow.
about 10 days, sorry.
Okay,
And he asked his friends
then you
in
should
a,
transition.
he
Okay.
asked his friends in a Nicaraguan peasant organization, which at that time was also part of Via Campesina, no longer is, called UNAG. What's interesting for me to do since I have 10 days here in Nicaragua? And they said, oh, there's this agroecology movement amongst the peasants in some of the more remote provinces called the farmer to farmer or campesino or peasant to peasant movement. You can go visit that. So he said, okay. And he went and he visited. And what he discovered was that the peasants had identified as peasant promoters, peasants who already had good agroecological farming practices, and then would organize visits by other peasants to their farms to learn about those practices, be inspired about them, and take some of them back to their own farms. And it turns out that the Nicaraguan peasants had actually learned this social process methodology, the campesino a campesino or peasant to peasant methodology,
Mm,
from exchanges with peasants in Honduras and Mexico. And it turned out that the
mm.
peasants in Honduras and Mexico had learned about it from peasants in Guatemala. And the peasants
Oh,
in
wow.
Guatemala were indigenous people who, when the Green Revolution and the whole idea of monoculture was imposed on them by their right wing government, weren't happy with it and were concerned that many families were losing the traditional farming knowledge. And so they created this methodology of peasant to peasant exchanges as a way of recovering the knowledge that was being lost and sharing it amongst the
Mm,
peasant communities. So this peasant to peasant methodology had spread around to different countries. At
mm,
this point, it was quite active, being actively used by peasants in Nicaragua to quite a successful extent. And
mm,
so our friend named Chirino was in Nicaragua from Cuba, seeing this, and he said a light bulb went off in his head, and he said,
mm,
"This is what we need in Cuba because we're not getting out of the food crisis just with this top-down conventional agricultural extension run by the Ministry of
mm,
Agriculture, trying to teach peasants the knowledge from scientists." The amazing thing in Nicaragua, he said, was that peasants were learning from peasants who, for one reason or another, were already successfully practicing agroecology, either because they learned it
mm,
from their parents and grandparents, or because they learned it from other peasants, or because they innovated or invented practices themselves, because actually peasants are scientists and have been for thousands of
mm,
years and are always
mm,
experimenting. But for whatever reason, they were sharing that knowledge with other peasants and it was being very successful. So he said, okay, that's what we need in Cuba. And he went back to the Cuban peasant organization, to the ANAP, and he said, I've just found the solution to our problem. We, as a
mm,
peasant organization, need to organize our membership in these kind of exchanges. And we need to,
mm,
even though monoculture became the norm in Cuba,
mm,
it wasn't 100% the norm. There were always, like there is everywhere in the world, those peasants
mm,
who still did older practices. And I think if any of our listeners stop to think about it, imagine yourself in any small farmer peasant village in any country in the world, even if most people have a monoculture and use chemicals. If you start to ask them, they'll say, "Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. There's that old man in the village who still has all of
yeah,
the fruit
exactly. Yeah.
tree
Mm,
varieties,
mm,
or there's that old lady who has the original vegetable seeds that everybody
mm,
used to use, or there's the family that still raises the local goat or the local pig breed that everybody
mm,
used to raise in the past before the modern animal
mm,
husbandry and
mm,
so-called improved breeds came in."
mm,
So actually, the knowledge was still there, broken into little pieces,
mm.
but still fragmented, but
Yeah.
still there.
Mm,
So what this methodology does is to identify who in the village or the territory or the municipality or even the province still has the
mm,
knowledge that's necessary to overcome various kinds of problems that are
mm,
impeding higher production? And how can those people who are peasants themselves share that with other peasants who need that knowledge in order to overcome the same problems themselves? So Cuba was no different. Even though it was mostly
mm,
monoculture, there was still that scattered knowledge. And so immediately in 1997, the National Peasant Organization started these kind of exchanges. Initially in one province, they immediately saw that it could be very successful, and they increased it to three provinces. It was growing, let's say, like a wildfire. Peasants were getting excited. We're going to exchanges. We're exchanging this knowledge. We're putting it into practice. We're producing
mm,
more. And so they said, okay, this has to go national. And although the original province, they had funded it with money from international cooperation. In this case, it was Bread for the World and
mm,
Oxfam. They thought, okay, but right now we're in a critical food crisis. If we want to fund the national process through international cooperation, we're going to have to write dozens of grant proposals, put them into the funder
mm,
cycle, wait to see if they're approved or not, wait to see if the money comes, and maybe in a year and a half we might have some funding. But Cuba can't wait. The food crisis is now.
mm,
So they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to promote a movement inside a national peasant organization, and we're going to call it the
mm,
agroecology movement, the
mm,
farmer to farmer agroecology movement inside the ANAP. And the method for creating this farmer to farmer movement is going to be the farmer to farmer or campesino to campesino methodology.
mm,
And
mm, mm,
completely done, and this is a very important point, by the peasant organization. Because the Ministry of Agriculture never to this day, even though there's so much success with agroecology in Cuba, never really accepted agroecology because the government officials in the ministry, they were all trained in university agronomy and the Green Revolution. They have the chip in their head of monoculture of the Green Revolution, and
mm,
let's say they have a charitable view towards agroecology, which is that okay, it's helpful in the meantime until sanctions are lifted, and once sanctions are lifted
mm.
someday in the future, we'll go back to the old industrial agriculture, chemical monoculture model. That's the mentality in the Ministry of Agriculture. So they actually have
Still,
some, so it's still to this day in 2026, they have some very good government policies to promote agroecology, but they were government policies won by the ANAP from a grudging ministry. And the ministry only
mm,
accepting to do those policies because they could see in the short term there's no alternative for people to eat. They had to basically accept the reality was that actually Cuban peasants are producing, no inputs are being imported, somehow they're producing, and okay, we should support that, as they would say, in the meantime. And so it was the
mm,
peasant organization itself using what we call a social process methodology, the campesino to campesino or peasant to peasant
mm,
methodology, in order to, and at this point we could say over about 30 years, through these very local farmer exchanges, getting to more than one half of all of the peasant families in the entire country practicing agroecology and having pretty much given up on any kind of monoculture or input dependent industrial farming, therefore constituting the biggest success story anywhere in the world in terms of the proportion of any country to go towards agroecology.
I mean, why is the resistance? It's baffling, because they could see that it's working. But one story that I hear constantly from QA is also they have spread it in urban areas. So there is urban agroecology practice.
Yes, yes, very much. Because
Mm,
because Cuba doesn't only have no food imports, it doesn't
mm,
only have no imports of fertilizer and tractors and pesticides and commercial seeds, but it also, and even worse now with Trump imposing the petroleum blockade, it has no
yeah,
petroleum and therefore no gasoline or diesel. And therefore, how do you move a perishable crop like a vegetable or a fruit from a rural peasant cooperative into a city where people are hungry?
yeah.
Basically, you don't because it'll rot by the time it gets to the city on the back of a mule or whatever other alternative there is. And so this has given rise to a very vibrant urban agriculture movement, which is also based
Mm,
on agroecology. And as urban people organize into cooperatives and use abandoned land in the city for urban farms, they also become members of the ANAP National Peasant Organization, and they benefit from this ongoing process of farmer to farmer exchanges about agroecology.
Well, we've covered quite a lot of ground, a lot of questions. Let's come back to this government workers and the Green Revolution agenda. It seems to ingrain itself in the DNA of government workers.
Yes.
So can you explore that a little bit? What is a Green Revolution agenda? And why are government people, and some even in the scientific quarter, are so much for it?
You know,
And what's the consequence of that? Yeah.
and it's true in every country in the world.
Yeah,
Very
yeah. It's
sadly,
not
every
only
country
Cuba.
in the world.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
say that Cuba has the most friendly to peasants government of any country in the world. And even in that friendly to peasants
Yeah.
government, the Ministry of Agriculture is still thinking green revolution.
Mm,
What is the
mm,
green revolution? It's the kind of industrial farming practices that originated in the United States and then were exported
mm,
to the rest of the world through U.S. development assistance and cooperation. And it basically means that instead of using traditional farming practices, farmers should transition to monoculture with bare soil
mm,
between the plants because herbicide will be used to kill all the weeds without any
mm,
traditional practices to maintain soil fertility. Rather,
mm,
chemical fertilizers should be bought and
mm,
applied without any traditional practices to control insect pests or plant diseases, but rather insecticide and fungicide should be bought
mm,
without any traditional seed saving and seed exchange practices, but rather commercial seeds bred by the seed industry to require fertilizer and expensive irrigation in order to be productive should be bought. And I think
mm,
really what that was the United States international development assistance creating in countries that didn't have them or transforming in countries that did ministries of agriculture
mm,
into salespeople for the agricultural input industry at that time largely based in the United States. So essentially, ministries of agriculture were created in order to be the people who would convince farmers to buy imported fertilizer, to buy imported pesticide, to buy imported seeds, to buy imported tractors, to buy imported irrigation equipment, and to become a global market for the giant corporations that produce all of this stuff, which were originally mostly based in the United States. Now, several of the important ones are based in other countries as well, but they're still the global
mm,
corporate class. And so the state was instrumentalized very early on into being
mm,
the sales force for this global agricultural input industry and giant corporations. And
mm,
this was,
mm,
as you say, put into the DNA of the
mm,
state. And so if today
mm,
we can say that there's a logic of the state, that is one of the logics of the state, that agriculture should be in monoculture and it should be dependent on purchased inputs, which are mostly going to be imported for most countries in the world, thereby very expensive, and thereby these giant companies taking a big bite out of the profits of farmers. Because if farmers, let's say, make $3 for their melons, they now have to
mm.
pay $2.50 of that for all of the inputs that they bought to grow those melons from these giant corporations. And
Yeah.
so instead of them getting $3 of profit, they're only getting 50 cents or less of profit. And
Yeah.
these giant corporations have taken big bites out of the profit
Mm,
margin of farmers through the intermediation of the state as the sales force for these corporations. And so also U.S. development assistance created faculties of agronomy in all the countries in the global south, where
mm.
technical staff were prepared to basically be this sales force, what we call agronomists. The origin of the university trained agronomist working for a government agricultural extension service was originally trained in faculties of agronomy that were created to prepare the sales force for
Yeah.
these corporations.
Yeah, Peter, one argument from my interaction with a number of governments, especially African governments, is that agroecology can be, I mean, agriculture can be an engine of the growth of a country. Yeah,
Yes, I agree with that.
it has to be a source of income from trade, external trade. So if that is the case, then we have to do economy of scale in terms of production. For that, agroecology is not suited. What is suited is industrial agriculture. That's one narrative. The
Right.
other narrative is also we have a number of people who need food, and this number is increasing. And productivity is a major, major, major agenda. And to do that, I think what would help us is technology, export-oriented agriculture, improved varieties, GMOs, these are
Yes.
two very powerful narrative. On this, you can add also, how do you get farmers out of poverty?
Right. Poverty
So,
alleviation.
yes, yes. The only way that you can get them out of poverty when they get a lot of money, and money they can get only if they produce for the market. This is a narrative. It is very, very powerful, as you know.
Yes. Let's unpack it. I would say these three
Yeah.
narratives are really one global narrative. The global narrative, which is based on free trade, on export agriculture, on monoculture, on dependency on chemical inputs and machines, and it's a narrative that was actually dominant in both capitalist countries and in socialist countries when socialist countries still existed. And so we have to unpack that narrative because, in my opinion,
Mm,
what it is a series of myths, or even to be rude, I could say lies, tied
mm,
together in order to create a believable narrative that essentially justifies this global profit taking by these global corporations and actually works in detriment to alleviating the poverty of farmers and
mm,
to creating real broad-based economic development in countries in the global south. So we have to
mm,
unpack it. And I think the Cuba case is very helpful to us in terms of unpacking that narrative because here
mm,
we have a country that okay, they're in an economic crisis, but they're not dead. They're not dead because food is still being produced. Food is still
mm,
being produced, and production, by the way, has been increasing all the time. Still being produced by who? By small farmers.
mm,
How about the living standards of those small farmers? As their
mm,
production has increased almost continually for decades, their living standards have also increased for decades.
mm,
And so farmers have remained small farmers, and since they switched to agroecology, have been improving their living standard ever faster. So right there, we could say
mm,
the lifting farmers out of poverty can through industrial farming is a bit of a myth because we have a counter
mm,
example where peasant farmers are becoming better and better off through agroecology and through also organizing themselves in cooperatives, which is another
mm,
element in Cuba. Then we can say, well, what about productivity? And it turns out that the productivity arguments really only work if we're talking about monoculture. So if I'm
mm,
growing just maize and I'm producing 2 tons per hectare of maize, and now I buy more chemical fertilizer and more commercial seeds, whether they're GMO or hybrid or whatever, and invest more money in irrigation equipment, maybe I can boost that from 2 tons per hectare to 4 tons or 5 tons. So it looks like this industrial agriculture model, if you spend enough money, you can boost production through
mm,
it. But what's missing is the comparison. So if we
mm,
talk about 1 hectare of land under that industrial model, whether it's producing 2 tons of maize or 5 tons of maize, one key feature is it's only producing maize, only
yeah,
one
only
product,
yeah.
whether it's 2 tons or 5 tons. If we compare that to a hectare under more traditional or more agroecological peasant management, we will find that maybe they're producing maize, but they're also producing several kinds of beans. They're also
Yeah,
producing all kinds of vegetables, all kinds of valuable tree crops. They're mixing the production of livestock, of goats, of pigs, of sheep, of cows,
yeah,
of chickens, of ducks within that. And so instead of 5 tons of one product, what they have is 17, 18, or 20 products from the same hectare. And I've actually done this research in the past. If you add up the value of all of those 17
Yeah.
crops
Yeah.
in 1 hectare and you compare it to the value of the 5 tons of maize under a very good industrial uh, production model, we will find that in every country for which this data is available and disaggregated so we can do the calculations, the small farmer diverse agroecological plot produces 2 to 10 times more total production per hectare.
Okay.
So
Mm.
they've tricked us by only looking at a monoculture into
Mm.
thinking that their way is the best way to boost productivity. But if we look
Mm.
at not a monoculture, but all of the diversity of things that can be produced together in a synergistic way using agroecology, then their best effort at productivity increase falls way short of the productivity increase that agroecology by
Yeah,
small farmers can
exactly.
produce. And the data in Cuba completely supports that the more agroecological the farm, the more production per hectare, and interestingly enough, also the more production per hour of labor applied. Because
Mm.
often
Mm.
people say, okay, agroecology could produce a lot, but it would be so labor intensive that it wouldn't be profitable. But actually, both the profitability of land and the profitability of labor in the Cuban model have gone way up the more that agroecology has been implemented. And the final thing about this export-led model, under the
Sorry. So can you unpack
yes,
that a little bit? I didn't
yes.
get the
Okay,
labor
okay.
part of it
So one
because
of
it's a
the
very,
things
very
that,
critical
yeah,
question.
part
Yeah.
part of this narrative is that the problem with agroecology is it's very labor intensive. So
Yeah.
you're going to do a lot of work to control pests, maintain soil fertility, etc., and that work could be saved if you just sprayed a chemical on the whole thing.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
so, maybe only economists will understand it, but economists talk about something called labor productivity, and you could think
Mm.
about either the tons of food produced per worker per month or per
Mm.
year, or the profit produced per worker per month or per year. Either way
Mhm.
that you look at it, it turns out that in the agroecology model in Cuba, this productivity per worker or per farmer, per member of the farmer family, however you want to call it, but economists will call it a worker because they're focusing on labor.
Mm.
There actually is more productivity, whether it's measured in volume of production, like tons of food, or
Mm.
in value of production, like profit per hectare, under the
Mhm.
agroecology model. So that turns out to be yet another one of their myths in this overall narrative. And then
Okay.
the final myth is that countries are better off using their agriculture for export and importing their food
Mm. Mm.
than if they're self-sufficient and produce their
Mm.
own food. And this also, I think, turns out to be a great myth because we can look at the period since World War II until now, and we could say after World War II, many countries in the global south were all more or less equally poor. And then at
Mm.
some point, some of them under the tutelage of colonial powers or former colonial powers or neo-colonial powers like the United States maintained that export orientation that was a key characteristic of colonialism. Colonialism had colonies so that the colonies would produce exports for the home country. The
Mm.
colonies are now independent countries, but they should still produce exports for the former colonial powers. Like
Mm.
no change even in the basis of agriculture, even though countries are now nominally independent. That
Mm.
was the majority of the countries followed that model. More and more and more export of sugar, of coffee, of fruit, of whatever, of meat in the case of Argentina,
Mm.
but not producing enough of their own food. A few
Mm.
countries took a different model after World War II, and those few countries are now amongst the most wealthy countries in the world. What those
Mm.
countries did was they did radical agrarian reform. They took all of the land away from the rich landowners. They gave it to small peasants, and they basically, those small peasants, rather than producing for the export market, they produced for their
Mm.
own urban market inside their own country where new industries were growing up. These were countries that were not industrial but started to industrialize after World War II. And that industry wasn't an industry that from day one was trying to export to the United States or Germany and thus competing with US industry or German industry.
Mm,
No, that industry was directed towards producing in the beginning consumption goods for the internal market inside that country.
mm,
And that internal market was strong because poor people, i.e., peasants, had gotten land and suddenly had higher incomes and therefore
mm,
in the aggregate had higher purchasing power. And so that
mm,
those countries' new industries became strong, producing for the rural market of peasants who now had higher living standards and more disposable income. And that allowed both agriculture to become stronger, peasants to become better off economically, and those new industries to become strong. And they became strong producing for their internal market for like, say, 20, 30 years, and then launched into the global market, exporting to the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world, but now as already strong industries. And those countries are China, South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, amongst the most successful countries
mm,
anywhere in the world today. If you measure countries in terms
mm,
of economic success and economic development, they were all just as poor as any Latin American or Asian or African country after World War II, and now they're economic powerhouses. And they did not
mm,
do it by following that narrative that you've so ably explained to us that
mm.
government officials all around the world, which one used to be called the Washington Consensus, that
Yeah,
narrative.
yeah. Yeah,
They
thank you.
became successful as countries by ignoring the advice from Washington and doing everything differently. And so that
Mm.
last piece that countries should be that and their agriculture should be oriented also turns out to be a myth. So the whole narrative is
Yeah.
constructed of a series of myths or lies that we can unpack like we've been doing just now and show that in fact a small farmer model based on land reform, based on production
Hmm.
for the national and domestic
Mm.
market, and using agroecology can be a much more successful basis for achieving all of those things, reducing poverty, increasing production, having economic development in a country.
Thank you so much. Fascinating, fascinating. Before we go to the final question, just want to comment. There is this thing called also true cost accounting, as you know,
Yes,
where, these companies pollute soil, impact our health, contribute to even to poverty, to the crisis of local economies, pollute air, And the FAO calculated one time that close to 10.2, 10.3 or $13 billion per year from this true cost accounting. So it has a cost. But the contribution of agroecology is virtuous. It adds to the
yes.
value of the land, to the health and everything. But finally,
Wait. Let me
uh,
just say that I
yes,
agree with what you're implying, which is that I've just shown that agroecology can be better than industrial agriculture using conventional accounting. It's even
yeah,
better if we use true cost accounting
yeah,
because all of those negative impacts on society and the environment of the industrial
yeah,
agricultural model are being paid by the public health system, are being paid by consumers, are being paid by everybody except the agribusiness companies themselves. If we force
yeah,
them to pay the real costs, including those
yeah,
externalized costs through true cost accounting, instead of agroecology being twice as good, it might be 200 times as good. So if
yeah,
we use
yeah.
true cost accounting, it would only strengthen our
Yeah.
argument in favor of agroecology.
Excellent. Thank you. Finally, the one thing that comes to debate between food sovereignty and food security is like food. I don't know how much food sovereignty is now Cuba, but they say that food sovereignty and food security, we're putting them like the two sides of the coin, which is totally probably wrong to some extent. A country or a society or a community can be food sovereign, can also be food insecure. So instead of seeing them as two contrasting concepts, we have to see which one to apply where. What do you say about that?
Yeah, well, I think that we often think of them as contrasting, but in reality, I
Mm.
would say the of the two concepts or paradigms, or whatever we want to call them, food
Yeah.
sovereignty and food security, the superior one is food sovereignty because food sovereignty includes everything that food security has, but goes farther.
Mm.
So we could say the basic element of food security is that everybody have access to enough food every day. But the weakness of the food security paradigm is it doesn't say anything about who produces that food, where it's
Yeah.
produced, or how it's produced. It could be a global corporation, it could be a local farmer, it could be with poisonous chemical residues, or it could be with agroecology. It could be
Yeah.
produced in my own country or shipped halfway around the world, emitting greenhouse gases through the
Mm.
shipping. Food sovereignty goes that further step and says everybody should be food secure because every country produces most of the food that its people eat, and it produces it through its own peasantry, through its own national small farmers, and it produces it agroecologically. And so it's adding the missing elements to food security.
Mm.
Why do we sometimes see them as opposed? Because governments and international institutions and the private sector insist on isolating food security and making that the only concept. And if you
Yeah.
make it the only concept, you leave out all those additional elements. And so that's why we should switch to the superior concept, which is food sovereignty, which takes into account all of the elements that are important from a point of view of having access to food for the population, but also from the point of view of, as we discussed in this whole podcast, how to have more successful national economic development, how to have improved living standards for farmers, how to do less damage to the environment and have healthier food. All of these other things which are desirable and necessary are covered by the food security, excuse me, the food sovereignty approach, but are ignored if we leave it at just food security.
Peter, it's very difficult question to ask you now because we are in a global crisis. A crisis created by two intransigent governments attacking country after country, feeling powerful and don't not feeling the pain that everybody in the world is paying.
Yes,
We are in pain. Everybody's in pain right now, but they don't give a damn about that.
they don't.
But let me ask you a question. Do you feel hopeful for the future, especially in the food system and agroecology? Do you feel hopeful and why?
I want
It's a concluding
I
question,
will
yeah.
say that this is, as you were implying, this is not an easy moment to feel hopeful,
Yeah,
because it feels like everything is going in the wrong direction. We have the
yeah,
rise of right-wing governments around the world, of wars,
exactly,
a
yeah.
new wave of imperialism. So it looks pretty bad. But if we want to find hope, I think we have to find hope in people who are organized in their home territories. I personally always
Mm,
find hope from peasants and organized peasants and organized indigenous people and organized pastoralists in their home territories when they have the collective strength to start building their own alternatives and to start building miniature versions of a better world that we can all learn from at a more global level. So it's difficult to see a lot of hope if we look at it at the geopolitical level right now. So, where can we find hope? I think we can find it in peasant organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, pastoralist organizations, small scale fisher folk organizations, and networks like the African Food Sovereignty Alliance that group together all of these different
mm,
movements who are, in reality, in their home villages and territories and communities, are building small scale versions of these
mm,
alternatives. And I think that's essential to keep hope alive and also to provide these beacons of learning that the rest
mm.
of society and the world can learn from.
Thank you so much, Peter. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. It was
Thank you so
excellent
much, Million. I
conversation.
loved having this conversation with you, and I hope your viewers and listeners will enjoy it as much as we have. So it's great to see you, and thank you.
Thank you so much.